welcome you to an event on the digital road to recovery and how strategic investment in the stimulus package in IT network infrastructures can play an important role, not just in creating jobs, but driving innovation and long-term prosperity. I have a feeling that the bad weather is going to limit our attendance somewhat. We actually have an overflow crowd, so I think there's an awful lot of interest in this topic. So what I want to do today is I'm going to introduce our my colleague who will also present, and then our two respondents, and then I'll make a few remarks. I'll turn it over to Stephen Ezell, who will make a few remarks about the jobs analysis. I will then make very brief remarks on some of the policy ideas that we think should be going forward, and then we'll have responses from our two respondents. I would add Gopal Kunder was supposed to be here. He's the CIO of the state of Minnesota and also on the board of NASCIO, the state CIO organization. Unfortunately, I got a call from him yesterday. He has a state crisis that he has to deal with, and unfortunately won't be able to get here, so we will make do. I'll start with Stephen Ezell. Stephen is a senior analyst at ITIF and focuses on innovation policy there. And before that was a founder of a business consulting company that did services innovation called Pure Insights. Next to Stephen is Bracken Hendricks. Bracken is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, CAP, where he works on issues of climate change and energy independence, infrastructure, and economic policy. He was in the Clinton administration as the special assistant to Vice President Gore within the Department of Commerce, NOAA, where he worked on interagency climate change working group, the President's Council on Sustainable Development, White House Livable Communities Task Force, issues of public safety, e-commerce, oceans, and trade and energy. He's also was the founder and the first executive director of the Apollo Alliance, which is an alliance for significant investments in green energy. In a long bio, I won't go through all of it. He's a member of Governor Ed Rendell's Energy Task Force and also on the Energy Future Coalition. He's also, like me, a graduate of urban planning, so he brings what I would say a common sense approach to problems that only urban planners can do. Next to Bracken is John Irons. John he's at the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, where he's research and policy director. He's been there since 2007. And his areas of research are economic policy, particularly with a focus on federal tax and budget issues. Prior to that, he worked at CAP. I think everybody in Washington, if you haven't worked at CAP, you will at some time in your career. Or if you're at EPI, you go to CAP, and then vice versa, you go back to EPI. But he was the director of tax and budget at CAP from 2004 to 2007. Before that, was a tenure track professor of economics at Amherst. Worked for Brookings, also the Federal Reserve Board. Has a number of publications, including one I'm sure you've read, and I've read as well, Testing Endogeneity, one of my favorite books. I actually remember what endogeneity is from my statistics class, but that's about all I can do. So they will make brief comments on our report, which you haven't seen is out there on the table. I think when we think about the downturn that we're in, which most economists suggest is going to be certainly longer than expected, longer than normal, that we need to be thinking more creatively about the kinds of stimulus. Normally, stimulus approaches are seen as you do it a very quick hit, you get money out the door within a month or so, and then hopefully that brings everything back. The consensus now is that this is going to be a longer-term problem. Therefore, it opens up a whole new set of ideas that we can focus on. And I think it's important to recognize that stimulus, if all stimulus does is go towards spurring consumer demand and consumption as opposed to investment, it may create jobs, but it certainly won't lead to anything in the longer term in the economy in terms of productivity and innovation. So that's why we think investment needs to be a key part of the stimulus package. Now, one area of investment that a lot of people are looking at is traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges and transit. And that's a critical component, should be a critical component of any infrastructure and stimulus package. I'm actually in my night job or day job or weekend job, I'm chairing a national commission that Congress created in the last Safety Lou bill on highway and transit financing. In fact, we're about to issue our final report in about 3 weeks. And it's clear there's a massive shortfall in physical infrastructure. But I think it's important to think beyond physical infrastructure, and we need to be thinking about what you could call intangible infrastructures for the new economy, and in this case, digital infrastructures. We think that investing in digital infrastructures, like health IT, like broadband, and like the smart electric grid, will have significant impacts, not just on jobs, as we'll demonstrate today, but on productivity and innovation. What are the benefits of doing that? Clearly, as Stephen will talk about, we think there are significant jobs benefits. We've done this analysis, which Stephen will get into a few of the details. And if we were to invest $30 billion in these 3 network infrastructures, and these are just analytical numbers, we're not advocating that 30 is the right number, but 10 on 10 for each, we estimate we'd create about 950,000 new or retained jobs. And over half of those, about 525,000 of those, we estimate would be in small firms of less than 500. I think one of the key things about this type of infrastructure is some people think, well, this is kind of science, don't you need a lot of R&D to make these infrastructures work? And the answer is clearly no. These are essentially shovel-ready projects, if you will, or computer-ready projects, possibly. They are essentially ready to go. Companies are in the process of making investments, but I think unless we do a stimulus approach to it, we'll get less investment than we could. Another advantage, I think, of doing this is at the end of the investment, where we would create or retain 950,000 jobs if we did this, we would also have significant increases in productivity going forward, which is going to be critical if we want to meet the demands, particularly of an aging population. From 95 to 2002, digital investment in the US, it was responsible for 100% of the productivity pickup. That was post-95. In the last 3 years, 2000 to 2005, IT was responsible for 1 full percentage point of productivity growth and GDP growth. I think the second reason to do this, besides the productivity reason, and certainly the jobs reason, is the competitiveness issue. It's clear that in the next decade, there are going to be countries all around the world who are going to be investing more in broadband and telecom equipment, more in health IT, and more in smart electric grids. If we invest first, if we get out there first, our companies will gain significant technical capabilities, economies of scale, that then they can leverage on the world scene, the world markets, and we can become more competitive as a nation. And finally, there's significant societal and personal benefits from investing in these infrastructures. Just to use health IT as an example, and there's clear evidence of this, that health IT reduces medical errors, it leads to higher quality care, it reduces costs, and that's a critical component for government. It'll reduce costs for both the federal government and state governments going forward. If we had a robust health IT system, we could go a lot further, for example, and we could do things like what some researchers are talking about, rapid learning networks, where we could know almost in real time what's happening with diseases, almost in real time what's happening with treatments, and are certain treatments not working or are other ones working better. Clearly, broadband is going to have similar effects. There's clear evidence that we cite in a report out there, digital quality of life. Families with broadband, all controlling for all their socioeconomic factors, children do better in school than families without broadband. Broadband's linked to more telecommuting, it's linked to telemedicine, it's linked to a whole set of benefits. And finally, smart grid. We essentially have an electric grid that Thomas Edison would recognize hasn't changed all that much in 100 years. It sends electrons in one way. And I think one of the big transformations that's happening in the country and the world is to make systems intelligent. If we had a smart grid, the evidence again is pretty clear, as we documented in digital quality of life, we would get a much more significant energy savings and a less carbon intensive economy. So with that, let me turn it over to Stephen to talk about the methodology and how we came up with these estimates, and then I'll wrap up with a few policy principles.
Thanks, Ron. as my colleague introduced, we find that a stimulus package that spurs or supports investment of $30 billion in 3 key information technology network infrastructures, broadband networks, health IT, and the smart power grid will create or retain approximately 950,000 US jobs, 525,000, or 55% of which would be found in small businesses. We find that policies that spur or support $10 billion of investment in broadband networks would create 498,000 jobs. $10 billion of investment in health IT would create 212,000 jobs, and $10 billion of investment in the smart power grid would create 239,000 created or retained jobs. Now, when economists go to look at the number of jobs that will be created from a given level of investment, they look at 3 types of jobs: direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced jobs. Direct jobs are fairly straightforward. With regard to broadband, for example, these would be new service jobs created in the laying and the installation of fiber optic broadband pipes to homes, or in the direct jobs created by increased demand for the fiber optic cable or the hardware equipment that goes into deploying broadband, the routers, servers, switches, etc. Investment will also create demand in indirect jobs. These are in the intermediate or supplier industries that provide component inputs to fiber optic cable, for example. So jobs will be created in the plastics and the glass industries that supply components to fiber optics. There'll also be indirect jobs created in intellectual or services industries that provide professional, scientific, or technical services, such as engineering, design, and network architecture. Finally, economists look at induced jobs that are created from direct jobs. Now, induced jobs are jobs created by the respending effects of employees spending their wages at restaurants, out shopping, buying a home, etc. We argue that with regard to digital infrastructure, they lead to a 4th order of jobs created that we call network effect jobs. Network effects arise from the new consumer and business behaviors, functionalities, and downstream industries enabled by digital infrastructure. In effect, this recognizes that when looking at digital infrastructure that isn't fully matured and isn't fully deployed yet, that the sum is greater than its parts. For example, with regard to broadband spurring new consumer and business behaviors, we have found that there is a moderately strong correlation between the degree of broadband penetration in states and the average computer processing speed, the CPU power, of computers in those states. So what that means is that broadband is spurring consumers to actually go out and buy new upgraded computers with faster processing speeds so that they can take advantage of the services that broadband enables, like video on demand, HDTV, telehealth, online education, etc. So broadband is driving changes in consumer behavior. And moreover, broadband has the power to seed and lay the groundwork conditions to be the fertile soil for the creation of entirely new industries that build innovative applications and services that are leveraging and taking advantage of the power of the more robust network. For example, without a fully deployed broadband network, you wouldn't be able to have innovative new business applications like Facebook or YouTube. These are new industries with new jobs that are relying upon the power of the broadband network to come into existence. As another example, eBay, a company that deploys a novel business model that aggregates supply and demand in a central location over the internet in a way never before done. eBay has found that 724,000 Americans report that they rely on eBay as their primary or secondary source of income. This is a great example that what we're talking about with investment in broadband networks isn't simply the first order jobs pertaining to laying the broadband pipe and bringing it to homes, but that investments in broadband networks create jobs in the computer industry, in the webcam industry, in peripherals as people buy computer speakers and webcams. We find that these network effects occur in health IT and for the smart grid as well. With regard to health IT, the ability to now consult with your doctor remotely, called telehealth, has spurred consumers to go out and buy web cameras and other equipment for their computer to take advantage of this new opportunity, this new technology that Health IT enables. Health IT has also created entirely new companies like WebMD and new services like Microsoft Health Vault that use electronic health records whose value expands proportionally with the number of users on the network. We find evidence of the network effect at play in the smart grid as well. So as a fully deployed smart grid gets built out that brings intelligence to the electricity distribution system, that opens up new opportunities for consumers to go out and purchase smart appliances. Whirlpool and Maytag are already building new intelligent smart appliances that control power consumption based upon the time of day it's being used, whether or not you're paying more for electricity because you're using it at a peak period of energy demand. Appliances that can cycle off during periods of strong electricity use. Another example with regard to the network affecting smart grid would be the ability to create residential solar power and energy storage options. So a intelligent electricity grid would give consumers the ability to deploy solar panels on their home and actually sell energy back to the grid. An entirely new business model, creating entirely new jobs. The point is that these network effects allow for the creation of entirely new upstream industries that utilize novel technologies and novel business models to create employment. Our methodology for measuring the employment impact of a given level of investment in each of these three information technology infrastructures can be summarized in, if you look at page 2 of your handouts and refer to the slide in the upper right-hand corner, I will walk you through a brief explanation of how our methodology was used to calculate the number of jobs generated from a $10 billion broadband investment. We began by asking what are the investments required? What are the costs to deploy broadband? And we found that 45% of the cost to deploy broadband is found in the labor component. That's actually in the technicians who are stringing the fiber optic cable to your home or bringing the DSL or cable modem service to your home. And we found that 55% of the cost of deploying broadband is in actually purchasing the hardware, the capital equipment, the fiber optic cable, the routers, switches, and servers that go into deploying broadband. So out of a $10 billion investment, you're going to allocate $4.5 billion to the labor component and $5.5 billion to the hardware and capital equipment component. To find the number of jobs that would be created by the allocation to the labor component, we turn to the Bureau of Labor Statistics to find the average annual salary for workers in the telecommunications industry and loaded it up with all the overhead, all the benefits that are required to deploy those employees, and found that the average salary for workers in the telecommunications industry was about $90,000. And if you divide that by 4.5 billion, you come to 50,000 direct telecommunications jobs created, as we've shown here. Now, how do you account for the number of jobs that will be created from the purchase of direct capital equipment from the computer and electronic products industries? Well, what we did was we looked at Bureau of Economic Analysis information that showed that 34% of the cost of the computer and electronic manufacturing industry is found in workforce compensation, or the labor component. So again, looking at the average salary for workers in the computer and electronic products industry, we were able to determine that $5.5 billion of investment would lead to about 20,000 direct capital equipment jobs created. Now the number you see here, 14,000, is cut by about 1/3 to account for the fact that about 1/3 of these jobs in the hardware equipment are going to leak out of the economy through imports of some of this capital equipment coming from foreign countries. So combining these, we come to an assessment that $10 billion of investment in broadband will lead to 64,000 direct jobs created. We then calculate Then we then calculate the number of indirect and induced jobs created using industry-specific employment multipliers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis to come to the number of indirect and induced jobs created. We then apply research into the network effect by criterion economics, which has found that for broadband, there's a network effect of about 1.17 additional jobs for every original job created to come to another 268,000 jobs. And so that brings us to about 500,000 jobs created from broadband investments, about 52% of which are in small businesses. We applied similar methodologies to calculate the number of jobs created from health IT, finding that 43,400 jobs would come from direct spending by hospitals and healthcare providers on health IT systems. And adding in the indirect and induced jobs and the network effect, we find that 212,000 jobs in total would be created from investment of $10 billion in health IT. For our analysis of the jobs created by a $10 billion investment in the smart grid, we used a slightly different methodology, which was to use data from Energy Insights that looks over the next 5 years at what the baseline level of investment in the smart grid industry will be, and to say, with regard to an additional $10 billion investment that is allocated to the four key industries building out the infrastructure, which are grid construction, hardware, software, and IP services, what the additional level of investment would be in those four industries critical to deploying the smart grid. And we applied what's called a final demand employment multiplier to those investment levels to come to the analysis that 240,000 jobs and with an investment of $50 billion over 5 years in the smart grid, that an average of 240,000 jobs per year would be created. In conclusion, our analysis finds that $30 billion of investment in digital infrastructure will have a substantial impact on creating and retaining U.S. jobs. And beyond the immediate jobs creation, they will drive productivity growth and deliver personal and societal benefits that transform Americans' quality of life.
All right, thank you, Stephen. This report is principally about looking at the employment impacts, but I want to just talk just very briefly about some of the policy implications of that and what kinds of policies we think would be most effective in spurring these kinds of digital network investments. And before I talk about specific policies, it seems to me that as I look at this debate and I watch how people are approaching it from a lot of different angles, it seems to me there should be three key principles that are guiding policymakers, whether in the incoming administration or in Congress. One, the first principle is don't hold new economy innovation-based stimulus measures to a higher standard than old economy conventional stimulus measures. And a good point, a good example of that, if anybody saw the Washington Post op-ed today on the stimulus, Ruth Marcus makes a quote where she says, quote, launching a new green energy plan or a program to computerize health records is a newer and more complicated endeavor, one that calls for more consideration. I don't think it's more complicated, and I don't think it calls for any more consideration than any other type of stimulus measure. If anything, I would err on the side of giving something along those lines a higher place in the queue, because we know that those kinds of investments are going to lead to higher productivity and higher quality of life for Americans. So in some sense, I think it's a mistake to say, well, we're going to have, these ones are new, we're not quite comfortable with them, we're going to hold them up, we're going to hold them to higher standards. The second is, I think the focus needs to be on getting as much digital infrastructure built in the next year or 2 years, whatever the timeline the policymakers think is the time period, getting as much built as possible. I worry that some advocates want to use this as an opportunity to drive their own particular forms of reform, which you can have a legitimate debate about. Should there be types of investments that do certain things? Like, for example, should broadband networks be required to be open? Interesting debate, but my worry is if you put a lot of conditions on these kinds of packages, what you're going to end up with is a much reduced amount of stimulus. And I think this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for our country to get an awful lot of stimulus, an awful lot of digital infrastructure built, and in all three areas get to real key tipping points particularly health IT and smart grid, where after that they can sort of run on their own power, if you will. The third key principle to me is we need to focus on a combination of both grants and tax incentives. And I think there are people who focus too much on one or the other. Both play a role. Grants are important because they can be targeted and they can be focused to types of institutions that don't respond to tax incentives, like nonprofit organizations or healthcare clinics. But tax incentives are also critical because they can be simple, they can get things done immediately. So I think we have to do both. Let me just go through each of the three areas very quickly, what we would propose. In broadband, there's three challenges. There's unserved areas, there's increasing speeds in underserved areas or existing areas, and there's getting more people on the network. I won't go into all the details, but essentially we think in the unserved areas, Congress should enact a tax credit of between 30 to 60% for investments that are faster than at least 3 megabits per second, depending on the population density. So if you're in a higher density area, you'd get a 30% credit. In a low density area, you'd get a 60% credit. As well, there should be up to $5 billion in grants to supplement that, particularly grants to serve areas that are frankly hard to serve, and the private sector is not going to serve them without a lot of incentive. Secondly, I think we can't ignore speed. While we're 12th in the OECD rankings on broadband on a per household basis in take-up, we're 15th in speed. So what we've proposed is incremental tax credits, essentially tax credits of between 20% for investment if you deploy broadband networks of 20 meg or more, and a 40% investment if you're deploying a network of 50 meg or more. And that would only apply in our proposal to CapEx above 85% of 08 levels. So if your 09 CapEx is above 85% of your 08, you get this incremental tax credit. I want to say a quick word about speed. I don't know that there's been an organization in Washington that has advocated more for higher speeds than ITIF. But I think it's a big mistake to have, we all would like 100 meg to the home. The Japanese have almost universal 100 meg to the home. There are about 80% of households with 100 meg to the home. It's a wonderful thing to have. But if you hold up the standard so high that only 100 meg to the home or only fiber to the home qualifies, essentially you're going to limit stimulus, you're going to limit investment in a dramatic way, because most companies in the country don't have that as their business model right now. So I think we should be realistic and say we want to push the envelope, we want to get faster speeds, but we need to be realistic. We would also propose similar tax credits for extending wireless networks. About approximately 9% of the population cannot get wireless right now. That's, to me, an important investment that will also serve as a platform for when we roll out 4G networks later this year. Those should be supplemented by strategic grants, again, for nonprofit organizations, schools, libraries, hospitals, government buildings, and possibly state government grants for them to do their own programs. On the demand side, demand is critical. One of the big reasons we're behind in the OECD is frankly because we have a much higher percentage of people without computers. Therefore it's important to work on that. We have a proposal that for the period of stimulus, computer purchases and broadband services would be eligible under the Lifeline and Link Up program, which is a current program now run by the Universal Services Corporation. And essentially, if you're buying a computer, you'd be able to get it at a discount and your broadband services. Health IT, again, I think a combination of tax incentives and grants are critical. We've proposed a tax credit of 40% of the costs of health IT investments made by doctors or hospitals that are in fully functional health IT systems, EHR systems that are defined by HHS as fully functional, and then a 25% tax credit for other qualified health IT investments. In addition, those should be supplemented by a program of entitlement spending and grants to nonprofit hospitals, community health centers, rural health clinics, and other public health facilities. Finally, in smart grid, again, same combination, grants and tax incentives. We passed the Energy Independence and Security Act in '07 that called for $100 million smart grid regional demonstration projects. We need to fully fund that. We seem to have a proclivity to pass bills now that are only in name and no money. That's true of the broadband mapping bill, for example, which should also be fully funded. In addition, the Act outlines a program for DOE to reimburse utilities up to 20% of smart grid investments. We think that, again, should be fully funded. And finally, accelerate depreciation or tax credits for smart grid investments and smart meters. So, in conclusion, I'll go back and I'll think about the depression. And I hate analogies to depression because we're not in a depression. We're not going to have a depression. In fact, U.S. GDP is up during the recession, not down. That's not to say that we're not in a serious problem and it's worse than it has been, but we're not in a depression. But when we were in a depression in the 30s, if you think about how the country would have been different if during the depression they said, we're going to stimulate and accelerate the most important network infrastructure of the period, which was the interstate highway system, and done it in the 30s instead of in the late 50s, where this country would have been. We passed the Federal Aid Highway Act in '38. Very little money was attached to it. We passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of '44, but like today, we passed the act but didn't appropriate any money for it. So it really wasn't until Eisenhower and the late 50s when there was serious money put to the interstate highway. So we essentially wasted 20 years as a nation. And I think the lesson to me of that is that we can use this opportunity to really accelerate these important transformative infrastructures, in this case digital infrastructures. And there's really no need to wait or no need to do this. Let me close by a quote from Gordon Brown, the UK was the Chancellor Chequer, now the Prime Minister of the UK. Gordon Brown was recently quoted, I think last week, talking about how the UK is going to approach stimulus. And he said, quote, "When we talk about roads and bridges and the railway that were built in previous times, and those were anti-recession measures taken to help people through difficult times, you could, by comparison, talk about the digital infrastructure revolution at a period when we want to stimulate the economy." And I think Gordon Brown has it exactly right. That this really is the most important part of the stimulus package that will, as Stephen alluded to and talked about, will create jobs. But it will also transform the country so that in 5 to 10 years we'll have a fundamentally different economy in terms of healthcare, energy, and in terms of broadband and information access. So thank you very much. With that, I'll turn it over to Bracken for comments, and then John, and then we should have at least hopefully 20 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I want to thank you all for coming out on a rainy day as well. And I'm very pleased to be here. I think this is a very important and very accessible study. It's extremely timely, and it makes some very significant contributions. I just want to step back for 1 second. We're not in a depression, I think that's true, but we are in a very decisive moment in terms of the direction the economy is going to take. And the conversation we're having today about investment and how to make strategic investments as we're contemplating a very, very substantial stimulus package is probably one of the most important conversations we can be having, because it's about direction and the sorts of choices we'll be making. I don't need to belabor the point, but household incomes are down to the lowest point. They're below in 1999. Mortgages, 1 in 11 are in default or in a very serious state. $350 billion have been lost in home values. 4 million manufacturing jobs have been lost over the last decade. And 1 million construction jobs have been lost just in the last year. These are very real economic problems, and real people are hurting. But more importantly, they mean that demand is contracting in the economy, and the case for stimulus is being made decisively and strongly from all parts of the ideological spectrum. Progressive economists like Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, calling for 4% of GDP to be spent on a stimulus. But similarly, Wall Street investors and Goldman Sachs are calling for very similar numbers. And the numbers are rising as people really look at the very serious contraction in demand that is taking place. So if we have a need for stimulus, what then can we do to drive new investment? And clearly, increasing consumption is the quickest and most direct way, and it's a helpful thing to do, and it's a meaningful piece of the stimulus package. But the Center for American Progress recently did a study with UMass Amherst, and we looked at the difference between a consumption-based stimulus, where you're trying to increase household consumption, and investments in a green stimulus that are focused specifically on targeted infrastructure like the smart grid, energy efficiency, renewables, and new technology and the sorts of enabling capacity that it brings online, as well as just investing in the old energy economy. And we found that an investment based in stimulus creates more jobs and better jobs. It creates substantially more jobs, about 300,000 more jobs we found than just investing in consumption alone. And the reason is fairly simple. When you invest in consumption, about 22%, we calculate, I think this study has a slightly higher leakage number, just flows out of the economy for imported goods. When you invest in infrastructure, in the skills of workers, in new technology, that money stays in a community. It's more local. It's also more labor intensive. So it creates more jobs. It also creates better jobs. We looked at a comparison between investing in traditional energy and investing like oil and investing in green strategies, which are more labor intensive, more skill based, more technology based. And they get at this centerpiece of this study, which is the network capacity, the ability to stimulate new industries, create new markets. And we found that they create more jobs at all levels of the economy, at all wage levels and all skill levels, but very significantly, 4 times more jobs overall than the traditional energy sector, but 3 times more jobs at higher levels, $16 an hour and above. So I think this study is a very important one in that it looks at wage levels, it looks at the ability to stimulate innovation and the additional stimulative capacity that comes with this sort of technology-enabling investment, the sorts of industry-leading and transformative sorts of industries that come about through IT, whether it is healthcare infrastructure, smart grid, or broadband. These are all things that enable new market activity. And this gets to another point that I think needs to be stressed at this moment when we're considering very large public sector investment. We are talking about public sector investment to increase demand and drive the economy, to prime the pump and accelerate it. But we are not talking about public sector jobs programs. This is not about investing directly in employing people. This is about stimulating the economy so that the private sector can be enabled, that new markets can be brought online, and business activity can take place. This leads us, I'm going to talk briefly about the smart grid, and I think that it's very, very illustrative of the broader points that are being made in the ITIF study today. Global warming is one of the most significant market failures the world has ever seen. We have a failure to look at the costs of our current economic activities, and they're very, very substantial. There is the most obvious cost, which is that inaction is not costless. There will be loss of agricultural productivity, loss of real estate value, loss of our capital investments in infrastructure as sea levels rise, as health impacts take place. Very, very substantial real damages will be experienced. So investing in strategies that avoid those costs have an additional benefit. But there's an additional market fix that goes on because there is a substantial cost from missed opportunities, from opportunity costs. And smart investments in clean energy technology has the ability to drive new technology. You have large industry recognizing the potential to move into clean energy technology, energy efficiency, smart grid technology, new infrastructure, but they can't do it alone. Because this is a market failure, no individual business can actually fill the gap. No individual worker or entrepreneur can solve this problem. We need public policy to create the enabling conditions, and that comes down to building the underlying infrastructure. And it's very interesting to see the sorts of businesses that are lining up to participate in the clean energy economy that something like a smart grid can enable. There is the basic opportunity for utility companies to rewire these jobs and construction workers to be put back to work. But there are also opportunities for traditional manufacturing. When we get a smarter, more information-enabled, rewired grid, you have opportunities for IT in buildings and appliances, for vehicle manufacturers. At the other end of the pipeline, bringing on new renewable technology is critically important. And you have old manufacturing companies in the industrial heartland. There's a company called Timken, and they make precision ball bearings. It's not something you think of as a clean tech business. But they are part of the supply chain for construction of windmills. They're a domestic manufacturing company created in 1899, and they're now supplying a global supply chain to bring new renewable energy online. Other companies like Honeywell or Johnson Controls, these are sort of bread and butter American industries. Owens Corning, they manufacture insulation. A massive program to retrofit buildings can do substantial benefit for stimulating these productive markets in manufacturing and creating new demand. And then you have new high-tech applications. Companies like Google, companies like, throughout the IT sector, there's a company over in Arlington called GridPoint, which produces smart technology for storage and for integrating solar panels into buildings. That will help the domestic economy and stimulate local business opportunity as we invest in these infrastructures. So I just want to really underscore that this public investment does not crowd out private sector investment. It actually has a crowding in impact. It creates more economic activity, more private sector opportunity than would otherwise exist. We can talk a little bit more in the question and answer about particular policy opportunities, but I want to underscore one other point in this study, which is there is a chance right now to directly invest in the smart grid. And one of the real barriers for smart grid implementation is that it's being distributed across a small rate base. But really the benefits are system-wide. We avoid outages, we create greater system reliability. No single group of ratepayers should pay the benefit for that. If we actually spread that cost across the society, that's a very smart piece of public policy. We have tools to do that in the Energy Independence and Security Act that hasn't been invested in. We have tools like accelerated depreciation. But one thing that I think is very, very significant in this study is they also look at the benefits of a mandate, which is not usually done in economic development theory. We think about a rule as being a costly imposition on business. But if you have a rule that's fixing a broken marketplace, internalizing costs, and creating guaranteed demand for new products, you are actually stimulating new markets. And we've seen it in a renewable standard, we've seen it with energy efficiency and in buildings, and we can see it with the grid as well. So I just applaud ITIF for looking at the power of rules to stimulate new investment. So I'll just come back to where I started, which is that this is really a question of direction. We are at a moment when we are contemplating one of the most substantial pieces of public investment in our lifetime. We are very wise to consider making these investments in a prudent way. We need to get the economy moving. That's absolutely, that's been proven. But we also need to get it moving in the right direction. And one of the things that this study shows is that we can take very near, immediate steps to create that type of economic activity, but we can do it with an eye on the long term. And that's where green investments and information technology investments make a tremendous amount of sense. And so I think it's critically important that we do look towards consumption-based stimulus, that we do look towards traditional infrastructure, but that we absolutely rule in these innovative investments that have their eye on the long term and that not only get the economy moving, but they get it moving where we need to go to solve problems like our failure in the healthcare system, like our the crisis of global warming, and like the digital divide that increasingly will exist unless we figure out ways to invest in information technology. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking.
Thank you, Brent. John.
Okay, thanks for having me here today. I want to first correct the record. The book that I co-edited was testing exogenating, not testing endogenating, which makes all the difference in the world.
I'm sorry.
I would highly recommend it to you, provided you are a time series econometrician. If not, it's a very lovely doorstop. It's past the holiday season, but maybe next year. Let me focus on a couple things here. From my perspective, an ideal economic stimulus is one that both gets the economy moving today, but also provides for the long-term needs of tomorrow. And so I very much applaud this work for bringing to the fore the role of information infrastructure to these discussions. There's a lot of discussion about roads, bridges, water systems, and now schools as well. But I think bringing the information architecture, the information infrastructure to the fore is very important. I am from what I call the kitchen sink school of recession fighting. You should throw everything at recession. You should throw some aid to state, you should throw some traditional infrastructure, throw some information infrastructure, and do a little bit of everything. Recessions are not happy places, and so we need to do everything we can to avoid it. And I think this is one important component of a broad, sizable stimulus package. Now let me focus on one thing that I think this paper makes a very nice contribution, which is the network effects. It is very traditional to go through these jobs analysis to come up with the direct impact, the indirect impact, and the respending multipliers. This is something that economists do all the time. They use standard Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers and multipliers from other government agencies, come up with job estimates, and that informs the foundation of much of what are in these numbers. But then there's this added impact, called the network impact. And so what I'd like to do is spend a couple minutes going through the network impact in the three areas identified in the report today on broadband, health IT, and smart grid technology, to try to get a sense of what these network impacts might look like, to get a sense of if the assumptions made in the paper seem reasonable. The bottom line is they seem reasonable to me, but let me flesh that out in a bit more detail. The top line number that's in this report is, if I did my math right, about 31,000 jobs, 32,000 jobs per $1 billion spent. That is a ballpark reasonable number. When you look at spending in other industries, you find some industries where you'll get slightly fewer jobs, there are estimates where you get more jobs, but this is in the realm of what I view as a reasonable number overall. So at least it passes a smell test initially. So when you look into the deeper calculations of this, I think there's a lot of reasonable assumptions there, but again, let me focus on the network component. A big caveat to all these numbers, though, is what I call a macroeconomic general equilibrium impact. A lot of these numbers are calculated using employment requirement analyses, which is roughly what we've done here today, which is to look at, if you spend $1 billion, how many people are required to perform the work that would create $1 billion worth of final demand. That kind of analysis is good for sector specific. When you're talking about a stimulus package on the order of $700–800 billion or more, you start to get these larger macroeconomic impacts. And in a time where we are operating at or near capacity, these numbers are not as believable because there are a lot of job shifts across industries. These are not necessarily new jobs. However, in a time when we have an economic downturn, it's much more easy to believe that these kinds of jobs can be created. These are new jobs. These aren't simply jobs being shifted around. So let me focus on the network impacts. As was mentioned today, the network externalities that are involved in these industries can be substantial. Value is added to others on the network when you add a new node to that network. So with the internet, adding an additional person to the internet creates value for everyone who's currently on the network. It creates someone else you can email, someone else you can, if you run a business, buy your products. If you're YouTube, someone else who can either post video or look at video. So when you add someone to a network, it creates value to the network as a whole, not just to the buyer and to the seller in that individual transaction, which creates a traditional economic externality, which means there is a role for government to provide some stimulus or some incentives to add that person to the network. In addition to the individual being added to the network, there's also a network effect when it comes to looking at new industries. If you have an entirely new network, you do then get the new eBays, the YouTubes, which are entirely new business models, entirely new businesses, and those will create jobs as well. So when you look at networks, you have benefit both expanding the network, but then you have the global impact of creating new industries as you create and expand existing networks. So in the three areas that were identified as areas for additional investment, broadband, health IT, and smart grid, I think all three of these areas have substantial room or substantial prospects for having this kind of a network externality. On broadband, you might think that the internet is already mature. A lot of people already have access to it. It's already been built out to a great extent. So there might be any more gains to further expanding the network. However, I think there is a difference between broadband, specifically, high-speed internet access, and more traditional internet access. And that the high speeds can very much bring additional network externalities. There are access to both YouTube, as was mentioned, access to movies, music, etc., which can only really be fully utilized with a high-speed network. So there's three aspects. We need broadband build-out, have more people actually have wires or fiber optic running to their house. There's a question about speed. making sure the backbone is fast enough to handle speed to the household. And then there's an issue of access and affordability, both rural access, as was identified earlier, but also access to low-income users of a network. And so attacking all three of these aspects, I think, is very important in order to really get the full benefits of a network accessibility in broadband. Now, the multiplier that was used in the study was 1.17. Is that the right number? I have no idea. It strikes me as being ballpark right. So I think there are probably very significant job impacts in creating, or in the businesses that would utilize a very strong network of people with access to broadband. On the health IT component, it's a bit harder, I think, here to define the network accessibility, although I think it does exist. If you think about health IT as simply converting paper records to electronic records, there's not a whole lot of network impact there. You'll increase efficiency, you'll increase healthcare provision in terms of cost and accuracy. You'll probably save lives. But the network externality is not necessarily just the conversion of paper records to electronic records. But I do think there is a network effect when you look at things like prevention. You look at the ability to gather information from electronic records across hundreds of thousands of hospitals, across thousands of individuals. The research that could be done if you have a standardized system for keeping medical records, it would just be incredible. Economists love to use existing surveys and data sources to try to draw conclusions. I can imagine a whole new medical research industry almost in terms of analyzing electronic records. So I think there are probably significant prevention aspects, significant research aspects, which could generate network effects in the health IT realm. In addition to that, I think on the consumer side, when you look at people's access to information, getting better information from their hospitals and then linking that up to things like WebMD, linking that up to their local pharmacy, I think there will be some externality effects here that are not quite as obvious, but I think they're still real. When you look at the health multiplier, it's about, I think, 1.3, which is less than the broadband, which again seems reasonable to me. Is that the exact right number? I don't know, but it seems at least ballpark plausible. On the smart grid side, I think there are potential huge network externalities here, because this is a very young area. And this is the establishment of an entirely new network, which could lead to entirely new industries, entirely new transformations of current industries. When you look at the appliance industry, if you have a smart grid technology where every refrigerator, every air conditioner, every washing machine could be connected to a broadband wireless internet, you're going to have new appliances or new add-on appliances to take advantage of that technology. And so this could mean, again, entirely new industries and transformations of existing industries. One huge caveat here is who's going to take advantage of this. We know that a lot of manufacturing is done outside the US now. And so if a lot of this technology is embodied in manufactured goods, we're going to run into some trouble. Manufacturing employment in the US has been down for years, if not decades. And so it's going to be a challenge to ensure that the domestic economy can really fully take advantage of smart grid technologies. I think we're right in emphasizing that there are already some manufacturers in the US who will take advantage of this. But I think coupling this together with a closer look at our manufacturing policy is an important point that we can't ignore at this stage. So let me wind up here and say that it's very hard to really get a handle on these job estimates. I think this paper does a very good job of giving us ballpark numbers as to what we could expect from, in this case, a $30 billion investment in these new information technologies. But I think this estimate actually could be too small because I think there is a macroeconomic impact here. For various reasons, the economy behaves as if there are a number of feedback loops within the economy. Right now, we're in a downward spiral. We have investment declining, we have consumer spending declining, and that feeds back on itself. As people spend less, people lose jobs, lost jobs when people spend less, and the cycle continues. Breaking that cycle is extremely important. And so when you look at these kind of job estimates, this is only really a sector-specific estimate. When you look at the broader macroeconomy, breaking that downward cycle can mean many more new jobs than these kinds of numbers would suggest. So I think this kind of effort, in conjunction with the broader recovery package, can generate many more jobs than is listed here. And I think this is a good start, but I think this is a minimum. I think we really can see many more jobs created as a result of this specific spending as part of a larger economic package. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I think we have plenty of time for questions or comments. I just want to make one response, John. We intentionally were trying to be somewhat conservative on our numbers, particularly the network multiplier numbers where there was less empirical work, just because we didn't want to be accused of overinflating things. So I'm happy to say, particularly on smart grid, I do think that the opportunity there is, is transformative, really. And so, but for our purposes, we were trying to be cautious there. So let's go comments or questions. There'll probably be a lot. If you can identify yourself first, we'll go right here, please.
Thank you. Paula Stern, the Stern Group, and I'm representing the National Center for Women in Information Technology today. But I would like to go back to an issue which may be an opportunity that we have also not anticipated. And congratulations on the report and all the comments today. And that's what we're really talking about here is industrial policy. And part of industrial policy, particularly in a downturn that we're in, often reverts to trade protection, trade policy, trade protection. What you're talking about really is an opportunity in a downturn in an industrial policy to look towards the future in investing in new, both new technologies for which you would not have kind of competition. But I think that by putting these things in place that you're talking about, you will also avert down the road historically trade protection and pressures for trade protection, and particularly when it comes to subsidies, because I believe that what we have in place internationally are rules about subsidizing particular industries that compete with specifically the same type of industry in another country, and then they import into the United States. Here you're talking about investing in the economy, not in specific, picking off one industry at a time. And I think you will avert getting into kind of the subsidy wars that we got into back in the 70s and 80s, for example, in steel, when UK and the rest of the world started to invest with their subsidies, and then we hit them in the United States with 23 different voluntary restraint agreements, and on and on and on. So I think there's a whole aspect of what your industrial policy is that I think has terrific benefits that y'all haven't naturally identified, but I thought I would try to identify, because when we talk about bailing out automobiles, or bailing out this, that's you're going to get into subsidy wars.
Okay. All right. No, thank you. I guess I would call this innovation policy.
Yes.
But no, it's a valid point. And certainly, if you look at what the Chinese did, where their stimulus package was about just blatant export subsidies, certainly part of it. That's certainly not the path we want to go down. We want to go down a future rate innovation path.
Exactly.
Right in the back there, sir, you right there, and then we'll go here.
I'm a lawyer, a telecommunications lawyer in Washington. And I happen to have been co-author with Jeremy Rosner of a Progressive Policy Institute paper in Rob Atkinson's days there, called Shortcut to the Information Superhighway, in which we forecast that the smart grid would be one of the engines driving broadband revolution in the United States. In that vein, I wonder if the authors of this rather innovative study, and I congratulate you for linking the health IT and energy piece together, but I wonder if you recognize that perhaps some of the communications technologies are more equal than others, in the sense that fiber optics is not only fast and broadband, but it also is immune to electronic radiation. And if your aim is to control the electric utility system, that immunity, that fact that it doesn't suffer from a radiation and it doesn't generate radiation, is a significant enhancement to the use of the technology. Many people in electric utilities say they are for the smart grid, but they are agnostic about how to get there. Well, that agnosticism is, in my mind, an excuse not to recognize the opportunity and the hardship of actually putting fiber optics where they need to have it. I wonder if you recognize the fact that of the various technologies, broadband power lines, the copper electronic telecommunications lines, wireless, they all have inherent limitations compared to fiber optics.
I really should have that question be addressed by Daniel Castro, who was a senior analyst at ITIF who wrote that part. Unfortunately, Daniel's in Atlanta and he can't make it. So I would encourage you to talk to Daniel offline on that. I guess I would go back to my other principle, which is it may be that there are sort of optimal technologies that we want to evolve to, but in the real world, we simply are not going to get a lot of fiber to the home in the next 2 years because their business models of whether it's utilities or cable or telecom companies, some are doing it, some aren't. So I'm quite sensitive to your point, but I think we also have to be pragmatic. And I go back to John's point about you want to throw the kitchen sink here. You don't want to throw just the faucet. I would say the kitchen sink is just get as much of this network infrastructure out there. The other part of that too is these networks essentially will get all the way to either fiber or super channel bonded DOCSIS 3, DOCSIS 4 to the home eventually. And the more we do it on this one, the easier it is to get there in short. So there was one question here, and then I want to.
I will add briefly to that question. If you read the section on smart grid, you'll note that we do talk about how additional investment in the smart grid is in line with national objectives to better protect and defend against cyber attacks, particularly those targeted against the power grid. So there's some recognition there of the ancillary security issues related to improving the power grid with information.
Great. Right here.
I'm Jeff Alexander with New Economy Strategies. I'd like to kind of push the scope a little bit on the direct jobs part. When you talk to telecom carriers, one of the limiting factors on rollout is having trained service people to do the truck rolls, keep the infrastructure out there. I'm wondering if there was any consideration about what kind of workforce skill investment is going to be required to enable these jobs to be created and filled, and is there any kind of ancillary, is that going to be a problem, or could it in fact be an opportunity because you need to have much better training programs and you need to reskill, especially in the utility sector, the energy utilities, you need to reskill the workforce to enable them to implement these kinds of technologies and take advantage of them.
It's not bragging that, but also just quick aside there. I think one of the things we have to recognize is there. I would predict that absent stimulus, you're going to see a cutback on CapEx in all three sectors, all three areas, and therefore you'll have slack, both labor supply and slack capital supply. We cite a Warburg study that came out showed that estimated about a 10% decline in broadband CapEx in 2009. Which implies a 10% slack workforce. So you'll be able to do some of this with just the workforce that would have been laid off. I think it's a valid point that there will be added workers and make sure that there's efforts there to help them. Frank, did you want to address that?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's great that you're putting your finger on workforce investment as a centerpiece of this, and I think it really is both as a tool for stimulus. You're putting money into the hands of people who need it, helping people get into the workforce, helping invest in human capital, just like we're talking about investing in sort of information networks. These are things that tend to get under-recognized in a sort of a traditional approach to stimulus. There is a provision in the Energy Independence and Security Act called the Green Jobs Act, which focused on investing in workforce around energy efficiency and renewable technology, would certainly apply to grid. There's been serious conversation about doubling the investment that was originally allocated. Nothing was ever appropriated. So this is another one of these examples where we've got pretty good policies, but nobody's putting the money there, and this is a chance to actually do what we had set out to do in the original statute. And one other thing that I think is an underlying point is the graying of the utility sector workforce is tremendous. The average age of a utility worker is in the high 40s or low 50s. And this is a workforce that's radically approaching retirement, and we are not anticipating this problem and not preparing for it. And it's another example of how we need to use short-term investments to solve long-term problems. We're going to need these investments very soon. We might as well start making them now and build this infrastructure, and we shouldn't be shy about putting it in a stimulus for that reason.
John?
Yeah, I just want to add one piece to that, which is, I completely agree that we're going to need to have some job training as part of this. It's important to look at the demand side for jobs as well. If this is simply a one-year investment, and then these jobs would somehow disappear, there's not any incentive to train people and then keep them on. I think we need to think about this as a down payment on long-term investments in these kinds of technologies, so that people know that there is going to be this pipeline of jobs that are going to be in existence for year after year after year, and that makes it much easier to entice people into job training programs. It makes people much more likely to hire someone if they know that incentives aren't going to disappear after a year or two. So I understand that the discussion here today is on stimulus, but this also needs to be part of a longer term discussion.
Also, just a quick point on that. One of the, I think this adds to the point of the network multiplier, is building the networks. Even though you only technically we measure jobs in 1 year, you will get some continuing jobs. If you extend a network out to rural areas, it's not that you build the network and walk away from it. You have to have maintenance of that network, and you have to have people who are trained to be able to do that. In health IT, when you build these networks, again, you have to have people upgrading software, hardware. You're going to also reach tipping points, so these things build on their own. So I think there was, I think, yeah, you had a hand up, and then we'll go here. Yes.
John Sago, CA Incorporated. Just a technical question on your estimates for multipliers. Could you speak a little bit about the lag effect? Multipliers usually don't happen instantly, particularly talking about innovative industries and business models. How did you account for that in your estimates and numbers, particularly in the 1 year estimate?
I think and maybe John can allude to this too, because he's done a lot of the solid work on sort of conventional, if you will, multipliers. Those multipliers occur generally fairly quickly. The indirect certainly is companies who deploy fiber cable, for example, or a doctor office buys them. Those work their way through the supply chain fairly quickly, as do, I think, the induced. Obviously not going to happen at day one, but they're fairly quickly. I think the network multipliers, it's an accurate point to say those don't happen right away. I think in some, we would argue in smart grid, for example, those probably are going to take longer, particularly the bigger transformative ones, like solar energy, like two-way electric cars, for example. But some will occur relatively quickly. I think in broadband, though, you'll get much quicker network multipliers, as we've seen. I remember when I got Fios to my house, connected it, and realized that my computer wasn't going to work. A week later, I went out and bought a computer, and I'm sure that Dell was very happy that I had then gotten Fios. So I think you will get some that are quicker than others.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds reasonable. There's error bars around all these estimates anyway, and looking at the time cap, how many jobs will be created, I would have a fair amount of confidence in the total number of jobs created over a 1 year period. If you start trying to break it down on a quarterly basis or out many years, I have much less confidence in those estimates, in part because the underlying BLS data is good for what it is. It could probably be improved, but I would just have less confidence in having a month by month, 2 year pattern of jobs. I think the general trends that Rob mentioned is right.
Yes, sir.
David Chafee Fiber Optics. Just a few points, all on broadband. First of all, you're talking about, one of the things that scares me in a way is you're talking about $10 billion investment in 1 year. You look at the Verizon Fios rollout, which is considerable, and that's like $3 billion a year, and they've had, at least initially, they had all kinds of issues regarding inventory, equipment, labor, trying to get the right pieces in the right places to install. They had to go through governmental mandates to try to conform with regulations. I mean, it just seems like an awful lot of money in a 1 year period of time in order. Now, I recognize the fact, first of all, let me say this is a tremendous idea. I absolutely agree with where you're going. The Brookings Institution, there have been a number of studies on productivity and that relate very positive correlation to broadband. But I'm a little concerned regarding the methodology that you're going to use to roll out, crank out that amount of money in 1 year, and that it's getting into the right hands to make it work. And a couple other quick points. If you're going to do this, I would second what the gentleman back here said about fiber optics, and John was talking about network externalities, things you can do once the broadband is there. Why not go to fiber optics rather than go to an inferior technology in the interim that you, as you pointed out, you're going to have to eventually replace with fiber optics anyway. I mean, you talked about Japan. There's like $10 a month for DSL service. They're getting 100 gigabits for like $50 or $60 a month. Don't we want to try to aspire to that goal? And the last point is, I was curious in your methodology if you looked at the Fios example, because it's $20 billion that people are spending from 2004 to 10, they're going by, what is it, 18 million, passing 18 million homes with fiber. I know they've created a lot of jobs. Are the jobs that they've created in line with the estimates?
A couple of points. It's, I think, very critical for people to understand what we're talking about when we say 10 billion in each of these. We are not saying 10 billion is the right number. What we're simply saying is we're going to take 10 billion in each of these as a methodology of estimating the number of jobs. What the number is we'll deliver it. Actually, for work I did for the transition team, we came up with a plan. We actually said it was probably more like 12, 15. If you look at the free press plan, that's 44 over 3, so sort of the same number. Well, I think it's important to recognize, I don't see all of this going into fiber. So if you think about where this investments would go, $1 billion to me could easily be invested in a lifeline link-up program. So you're not talking about technicians, you're not talking about capacity constraints there. You could also certainly, you're also, as I said, talking about reduction in CapEx. There's about 30 billion in CapEx in broadband, 8. So you're talking about a reduction perhaps of 3 to 6 billion there that you could pick up. You're also talking about some firms that haven't done as much. So I do think, and you're talking about some wireless deployment as well, new towers, about 10% of the population, maybe 9%, we have the data in there. There'll be certainly not yet a wireless data play or wireless at all. With regard to the inferior technology, look, we've pushed and promoted what Japan has done. We studied Japan in depth. There's also one big difference with Japan. They have unbelievably short loop lengths, which makes it a lot easier for them to deploy fiber, and they have very high densities. I think I would go back to my principle of one of the things that we want to do here is we want to build out as many networks as possible. And I don't think that you're going to be replacing inferior technologies. For example, if you look at the UVerse rollout with AT&T, it's fiber to the node, which then will ultimately, at some point, extend fiber to the home. They're not going to rip up the fiber to the node. That is an investment that will end up saving them money. They won't have to do it all the way. Secondly, I just don't think we should be focused solely on fiber. There are other technologies that could play a key role. Cable with DOCSIS 3, you can get 160 megs. I don't think we should be, that's where I think that's industrial policy. I don't think we should be picking winners and losers there. So I do think we need to be pragmatic about that. I do think that the other piece of this, by the way, I would add is sort of like John's point. If you put out grants and tax incentives and you put out enough for, say, 15 billion and you only use 8 billion, well, what have you lost? You haven't really lost anything, I would argue. So I would err on the side of having them more, and if there's take up on them, it works. I think a question right back here.
Yeah, Pat, a bit of computer world. How is the 30 billion arrived at? It's about 4% of the 800 billion that you're talking about as a stimulus. So if you went ahead and made that, 35 billion, would you create 31,000 jobs times 5 additionally? When you talk about the range of jobs, 995,000, how many of those jobs are actually going to be high wage jobs that actually boost household income? How many are going to be, say, fast food workers at McDonald's serving fiber optic cable laying crews? And what's a time frame for the creation of 995,000 jobs? And here's a more stickling question here. And in regard to industrial policy, you've kind of skated around this issue here about leaking of jobs overseas. Well, how many jobs would actually be created overseas from this? Let me give you a for instance. If you go ahead and say we're going to homogenize all the healthcare records, make it very accessible, transportable, you're going to go ahead and create an inducement for large IT companies to go to the hospitals and whatnot and say we're going to redo your systems. They're going to take that application development work and send it over to India. I mean, have you thought about some of those issues and what's going to happen, what the nasty headlines are going to look like when, application developer and some hospitals laid off?
Yeah.
So, can you go through those issues?
Yeah, I think the first point was about, I again, want to be very, very clear. We could have done this with 1 billion for each. We could have done it with $10 for each. We were just picking a number that had a nice round number to it and was a decimal.
Say that $10 million worth of investment has this level of employment.
Right. So if you went to 15 billion, you would get the same, assuming that you don't have capacity constraints, but you would get to the same number of jobs. If you went to 15, or let's say you went to 30 to 45, you get 50% more jobs. If you went down, you get fewer jobs. So it's a linear effect on jobs. with your point on wage levels, again, I'll go back to what John said. All multiplier effects include what's called induced. So induced are essentially, should in theory have the same level of income and job quality distribution as the entire economy. That's what it is, because people go out and they'll buy cars, they'll go buy McDonald's. So those, clearly, I don't think you should say somehow because we have induced jobs there that this job quality would be worse. Any multiplier is going to have induced. So the real issue is what are the direct and indirect and what is the job quality there. I think when you look at the job quality numbers that we have, they're actually much higher wage jobs. One of the reasons, well, if you look at the job estimates that are done on construction, they actually get a few more jobs in the direct and indirect, although not on the network. One of the reasons is because the jobs don't pay as much. So I would actually say it's exactly the contrary. These are actually high wage jobs at a lot of different levels. Last point, time frame again, I think we alluded to that. The leakage factor, I've heard people say this, but we're not in a closed economy, nor should we be in a closed economy. I'll go back to, again, a great, you should read this Gordon Brown piece in the I think, I'm not sure where it was, Manchester Guardian maybe, but Gordon Brown says, look, we're in a global economy, and that means that any stimulus package is going to have a spur for other countries. That's why we all have to have a stimulus package together. And I think that's absolutely right. And the last point on that is the multipliers that we look at from BEA automatically, so we looked at, for example, IT service jobs, and we accounted for the leakage, if you will, that's already going to places like India. I don't have a problem with jobs being done in certain places overseas. I agree with our panelists that we need a robust domestic manufacturing policy and a robust policies to make that more jobs are done here, but we do account for those, and I think I'll stand by the numbers in terms of what the leakage factors would be. John, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 points to that. On the timing. There's a lot of desire to get this out quickly, to start it right away, but it's important to note that the economy's not going to recover in the next 6 months. The numbers that I've worked out, looking at the job market in particular, if you look at the official NBER recessions, the last 2 recessions have lasted 8 months from the peak when the recession started to the bottom. We're already past that this time around. If you look at the job market, in the last recession in 2001, it took 32 months for the jobs market hit bottom. And it took 4 years for it to recover back to pre-recession levels. So we're looking at employment that's going to be 4 years to recover. So I think there probably are bottlenecks out there, but we're not talking about we have to smash through those in the next 6 months. We're talking about the job impact should be much longer lasting job impact, because we know the economy will be suffering for 3 to 4 years, if not longer. So I think that's an important point that I think is oftentimes lost in the desire to get things out the door quickly. Secondly, on the quality of jobs, some of the early data analysis that we've done at EPI confirms what Rob suggested. If you look at the construction industry per se, those jobs are better than average in terms of wages, in terms of benefits, and some other metrics. It's very hard to get a more narrow analysis of this particular kind of investments, but my intuition at least says that these jobs are likely better than your average construction job anyway. So I think, and you probably have, I think you have some more detailed data on this too. But from my experience and what I've seen in my analysis, that these are going to be better than average jobs. You're right, the respending jobs will tend to be spread out across the entire economy, and those will include McDonald's jobs as well as software engineering jobs. But on average, it's going to be better than average jobs.
Sorry, yeah, thank you, John. We will also post, and if you want to give me your email, I'll be happy to email to you. We'll also post our very detailed spreadsheets, and when you go to those spreadsheets, you can actually see what the job salary estimates are for all the various categories that we looked at.
2 points I'd like to add. First is that if you look at the broadband industry, the average wage for broadband workers is 42% higher than the national average. If you look at information technology jobs, they actually pay on average 84% more than average jobs. So yes, we are dealing with high skill, high paying jobs in these industries that we're talking about creating and retaining new jobs for. With regard to the international trade components, I would like to point out, first, I think we are honest by recognizing that a third of the manufacturing jobs created will leak out of the country through leakage, and that ratio of 33.3% was determined by looking at the total import of goods to the U.S. economy divided by U.S. aggregate manufacturing output. But moreover, I think it's important to recognize that not only will spurring investments in digital infrastructure create a market for the components and technical services of domestic firms, investing in these infrastructures now will also help to ensure that our domestic firms have the knowledge, skills, and capabilities needed to become chief exporters of these technologies in health IT services, in smart grid components, to other countries as they expand their own digital infrastructure initiatives. So these types of investments make our own companies more capable and more effective at fulfilling the international demand that will come into play as these networks are deployed in other countries.
We have time just for a few more questions. So,
Hi, Kim Dixon, Reuters. I wanted to see if two of the respondents, either of you or both, would comment on some of the other broadband stimulus proposals that are out there. Rob mentioned the free press proposal, and I know he's made some distinctions between their greater focus on tax credits. Some of the public interest groups have talked about, well, we really do need to get more players out there in terms of the duopoly that exists in terms of providers. Is there merit in trying to incorporate that into a stimulus package?
My depth is much more in the smart grid area, and I don't want to get into the particular policy mechanisms on the.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any specific comments on the other proposals. I think I will say in general, you know, we need to think about what is appropriate for a stimulus package versus what is appropriate for longer term policy. And I would echo Rob's remarks earlier, that there are some things that are going to be out there that are going to be very good proposals, one or the other, but should not necessarily be part of a stimulus package. And I think that given the speed at which this is moving, you know, if the president-elect wants it on his desk in the first couple of weeks when he's in office, there's going to be a lot of issues, you know, about the market structure, about you know, network neutrality, which you know, will need to be addressed at some point, but as part of an economic stimulus, that might not be the right place to have that discussion. I think that's about all I have to say.
I guess one thing I would just add, the Center for American Progress has folks who are working on broadband, and we have sort of a set of policies that we've advocated for, and there are some similarities and some differences. But I think that the place where the study is very useful is in looking at the aggregate impact of the cash flows into these sectors of the economy as opposed to other sectors. And I think John's point about sort of market structure, there's a bunch of kind of secondary impacts that it really is worth looking at the policy structure, and that's why some of the conversations about what's the impact on workforce investment or trade policy or the distribution of large and small businesses, these sorts of things, it matters a fair amount in terms of the distribution of tax incentives and versus direct spending and what sorts of incentives are there. But I think in terms of looking at IT as an enabling infrastructure that has immediate short-term benefits and a long-term dividend to the economy in terms of improving our productivity, stimulating new market growth, and increasing both efficiency and productivity, I think that's a point that is true regardless of the particular policy.
We are usually very religious about getting people out on time. As we said, I'm going to break that, but I'm only going to we only have time for really one more question. This gentleman over here has had his hand up for a long time. So yes.
I'm a telecommunications attorney in Washington, and my name is Tyrone Brown. I'm probably way beyond everyone else here. Do your job creation estimates capture what you describe in a quantifiable way as the transformative impact of these investments in the networks?
Yeah, they do. There's a couple of studies, in particular one that uses a fairly advanced econometrics, if you will, to look at how that plays out, and so we do include those. I think, as John alluded to, those are certainly those aren't BEA numbers, so they're obviously a little more tentative, if you will. But I think, as John alluded to, I think they're in the right ballpark. So, thank you for all your attention. I want to particularly thank John and Bracken for their very helpful comments. My colleague Stephen Ezell and Daniel Castro, co-authors of this report. So please join me in thanking a great panel.